Let's talk about this chemical attack. You tweeted about the attack, and I'll put it up on the screen. You tweeted this: whoever is found responsible, be it the Syrian government, Al-Qaeda, or ISIS, all have access to chemical weapons, must be held accountable. Who do you believe is responsible for that chemical attack that killed so many civilians, including so many children?
Here's the issue, Wolf, is what I believe, what you believe, or others believe is irrelevant. What matters here is the evidence and the facts. If President Assad is found to be responsible after an independent investigation for these horrific chemical weapons attacks, I'll be the first one to denounce him, to call him a war criminal, and to call for his prosecution, the International Criminal Court. Make sure that those consequences are there. But the key is now, with President Trump's reckless military strikes last night, it flew directly in the face of the action that the UN was working on at that time to launch an independent investigation, to find out exactly what the facts are, who was involved and who was responsible, so that the appropriate consequences could be levied. So,
Congresswoman, when the Pentagon says it was the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad who was responsible, when the Secretary of State says that, the President says that, they all conclude that they have the evidence to back it up. They say Assad did it, his military did it. You don't believe them necessarily.
Well, last time I checked, Wolf, Congress had the authority and the responsibility for declaring war, for authorizing the use of military force. So whether the President or the Pentagon or the Secretary of State says that they have the evidence, the fact remains that they have not brought that evidence before Congress, they have not brought that evidence before the American people, and they have not sought authorization from Congress to launch this military attack on another country. The fact is that the United States has been waging this war, this regime change war, now for years, covertly through the CIA, to overthrow the Syrian government. The result of this has been the suffering of the Syrian people, hundreds of thousands of people dead, millions of refugees, and the strengthening of terrorist groups in Syria, like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, whose goal is to overthrow the Syrian government. So this escalation that President Trump took yesterday in launching this military attack continues this illegal, unconstitutional war.
So, Congresswoman, are you saying when General Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, or General McMaster, the President's National Security Advisor, come to the President and they say, here's the evidence, we now know for sure that the Syrian regime did this, here are the various military options to respond, and he gives the okay, you say you have doubts about these generals providing that kind of proof to the President?
Well, Wolf, I remind you about what happened before we launched an invasion and occupation of Iraq. Then Colin Powell and many others within the administration came to Congress and came to the UN claiming they had the evidence proving that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. We launched a completely destructive, counterproductive war based on that intelligence, which has now, years later, proven to be wrong. We had leaders in Congress then who questioned that evidence that was presented and voted against that war because they were not convinced by the administration then, saying that they had the proof necessary to launch this war. So yes, I'm skeptical because we have to take at a premium the cost of these wars, not only on the Syrian people and the people in the Middle East, but the cost of these wars here in the United States at a time where, you know, we don't have money to build the roads that we need here in Hawaii or in other parts of the country. Why should we just blindly follow this escalation of a counterproductive regime change war, sending American taxpayer dollars on these failed regime change wars that we've seen too often in Iraq, in Libya, and now continuing in Syria?
Because the Pentagon says they have radar tracking that shows that Syrian regime planes were in the air at the time of this attack. They also say they have heat signatures showing that those planes dropped those chemical bombs in those areas where the civilians were exposed to that kind of nerve agent. But what I hear you saying is you don't necessarily buy that.
Well, once again, Wolf, all I'm saying is that we have an executive branch of government and a legislative branch of government, and we need to see the evidence. Congress and the American people need to see and analyze this evidence and then make a decision based on that whether or not an authorization of U.S. military force is necessary. And what I'm telling you is that that hasn't happened. I have not seen that independent investigation occur and that proof presented showing exactly what happened. And there are a number of theories that are out there on exactly what occurred that day.
You met with President Bashar al-Assad in Damascus this past January, just a little while ago. Do you doubt, Congresswoman, that he's capable of launching a chemical attack on his own citizens? Because the Obama administration said he did it back several times in 2013 until the Russians came in and said they would try to destroy all of his chemical weapons stockpiles.
Again, this isn't about what I believe or what I doubt. What matters the most here are the facts. The American people deserve to see and know of the evidence and the facts before authorizing the continuation of this destructive, counterproductive, illegal regime change war. Our interest, Wolf, must be on bringing about peace. That if we truly care and are compassionate for the Syrian people, these children and women and innocent people who are being most impacted by this war, we need to end this destructive regime change war, not escalate it as the president has just done through his illegal military strike launched last night.
Why did you meet, Congresswoman, with President Bashar al-Assad? You know, you got a lot of criticism for going to Damascus and meeting with him. Why did you decide to meet with him?
You know, I went to Syria in the interest of furthering the cause of peace, to see and hear firsthand from the Syrian people how we can bring about an end to this counterproductive regime change war, something that I have been fighting for now as a member of Congress for years. Whether we like it or not, President Assad remains the president of Syria. And in order to determine a negotiated outcome to end this regime change war, that again has cost hundreds of thousands of lives and millions of refugees, he has a part to play in bringing about that negotiated outcome. We should not continue this counterproductive regime change war, to overthrow the Syrian government, first and foremost because it will be destructive to the Syrian people, just like we saw our wars in Iraq and Libya turned out to be worse off for the people of those countries. And just like in those two countries, we're already seeing this war we've been waging for years has only proven to strengthen these terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and like ISIS, who are trying to overthrow the government so that they can walk in and fill that vacuum and take over all of Syria for their own nefarious means.
Who is responsible, Congresswoman, for the deaths of more than 400,000 Syrians, mostly civilians and a lot of children, elderly? Who do you blame for those deaths over the past 6 years?
There are a number of ways that you can point the finger, Wolf. I'm interested in finding the solution, and the solution is to end this counterproductive regime change war. The United States has been waging, along with allies, so-called allies like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, all seeking to overthrow the Syrian government. We have been providing arms, funding, salary, support, intelligence, and other types of both direct and indirect support to armed militants within Syria who are working directly with Al-Qaeda, who are allied with terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda towards this end of overthrowing the Syrian government. All an action which has resulted in more chaos and suffering for the Syrian people, as well as counterproductive to our American national security interests by strengthening the very enemy that attacked us on 9/11. It makes no sense, and I've spoken to you before about my bill, the Stop Arming Terrorists bill, that would put an end to this madness by prohibiting American taxpayer dollars from paying for this support, for paying for this counterproductive regime change war.
But don't you believe that Bashar al-Assad bears a lot of the responsibility for the horrific deaths that have occurred in his own country, his regime, his military going out there and killing all these people? Don't you think, Congresswoman, he bears a lot of that responsibility?
There is responsibility that goes around, Wolf. Again, my interest is in bringing about peace. Standing here and pointing fingers does not accomplish peace for the Syrian people. It will not bring about an end to this war. That is my sole focus and my interest, both for the United States and for the Syrian people. And that's why it's so important, A, that we end this destructive, counterproductive regime change war, and that we work towards bringing about a peaceful negotiation where the Syrian people can determine their own future for themselves.
You met with the president. He was then the president-elect during the transition in New York, and then you went in January to meet with President Bashar al-Assad. Did you convey any message to Bashar al-Assad from President Trump during your meeting in Damascus?
No, and any reports suggesting otherwise are complete, bogus, and fake news.
What was Bashar al-Assad's message to you, Congresswoman?
He talked about what was happening in his country, his interest in defeating ISIS, and talked about how to bring about an end to this war.
Do you have any regrets about going? Because you faced a lot of criticism, as I pointed out, since then.
You know, Wolf, I've never made decisions based on fear of what might people think or what might be politically advantageous for me. As a veteran, I have seen the cost of these wars, experienced them firsthand, seen the human cost in friends of mine who did not come home from the war in Iraq. I went to Congress promising my constituents, my fellow veterans and brothers and sisters in uniform that I would do all I could to prevent our country from making these kinds of disastrous and destructive mistakes again in the future. I went to Syria with the focus and mission on peace, how we can bring about an end to this destructive regime change war, and I'm continuing that fight today.